Reassuring response. This starts with, it just starts right off with some single note lines to set up this bebop flavor. There's a lot of chromaticism in these lines, but let's just kind of break down and do an overview of some of the techniques at play. It starts off with a single note solo over F, but before we go too much into the piece, we'd like to give context some of these changes because there's a lot of changes going by in this song. So a great way to do that is to use the thumb drop technique that we've talked about before, and that's happening right in measure 2 by dropping in the low E and then the A. So if you put those over the line, now all of a sudden the line, which may have sounded a little random before, I mean, that kind of outlines a 2-5, but you can further reinforce the sound by doing the thumb drop. Now, in this case, we don't resolve to a single D note, but rather a chord. So we hold that A, and this is an example of our sustain and release concept. This is going to sustain while we have a little, double stop underneath it. So we're going to hold this for the C minor 7, drop this, and then hold it, release it. Hold that one. So that's a great example of creating tension and resolution, not only in the inherent chord changes by putting in, an altered tone or an altered extension or something like that, but also creating the concept of tension and resolution through articulation. Some chords are held, some notes are chords, some notes are held, some are not. It just really brings your solo playing to life, So to look at those 4 bars again, leading up to measure 5, listen to the contrast in articulation as well as the note contrast. So here we have from the top, 3, 4, thumb drop, hold it, bounce, bounce. So now it's more of like a two-way dialogue in articulation as well as melodic statements. There's a lot of that continues throughout the rest of this A section. Moving into the second A section, starting with measure 9, we continue with some more trading off between chords and lines. But check out the end of measure 10, moving into the next 2 measures. We're using our intervals of tenths again to really create a nice, it's like a bebop line harmonized in tenths. So looking at it, we have, starting with moving into the 10th, outlining a D minor 7. And a great thing that you can do is just basically outline an arpeggio using tenths. So if we're going to outline the notes of a D minor 7, we're going to start with a root and then the third, but of course it's appearing as a tenth, and then we can just go right up through the chord tones from there. So we can play the 3rd and the 5th, the 5th and the flat 7th, the flat 7th and the 9th. So you now have this very nice, almost pianistic type of way of getting through. I mean, Bill Evans loved to use tenths. So you'd have this. So this line is just kind of like a variation of that, using a little bit of chromaticism here and there. We have this. Moving into the C minor 9. Resolving finally to the B flat. So that's a really nice technique that you can use. Try harmonizing some single note lines with tenths and work that out between your thumb, index, and middle fingers to get that happening. From there, we move into a variety of syncopated chords that move against the bass line. Now we're into the bridge, and another texture that we've used in here is double stops, but this time in thirds. And now that technique, or that chord structure rather, is a third with an octave. And this is a chord voicing that Jim Hall liked to use all the time. It's really a nice way to fatten up a double stop in thirds if you need a little bit more bass on the bottom there. Then we continue through some more single note bebop influenced lines. And finally, getting out of the B section at the end of 24, we move into the next A section with a real nice melodic statement. So in coming up with different ways to accompany that, we're just dropping in, we're using some thumb drops on some bass notes, and we're also using a thumb drop and the fingers to articulate the guide tones. And they're very simple guide tone structures. So taking a look at this, we have, that's an E minor 7, followed by an A. We're using an open string, but it's still the guide tone voicing. D minor 7 guide tones, D flat 7 guide tones. So it's another example of how practical guide tone voicings can be. You only need 2 notes to support that melody, and then you can put the bass in there, and you have a very complete arrangement without having to worry about too much, other information in terms of chords and your notes and your voicing. All right, so from there we work through a little bit of syncopation, and then that moves us into the next section of the song. A lot of the same things going on here, but there's single note lines interspersed with this constant motion of a moving bass line. One thing to take a look at, measure 39, there's a nice little triplet line there that ascends through the string sets that your speed roll technique that we examined earlier can come into play here. So basically, we're looking right at the top of measure 39. It's a G7, and we're anticipating a D that's held. And then from there, we're creating this little kind of line that bubbles up underneath it. So that physical pattern can be achieved by using one of these speed rolls. The way I'm doing it is P-I-M, so thumb, index, middle. Starting on the second beat there of that measure with the notes B, D, and F, we have this. And that's just kind of a nice little example of a speed roll that moves now across string sets instead of staying on one. So there are lots of possibilities with that particular technique. And this also utilizes the sustain technique. If you want to find a part of your index finger that can hold down that D, okay, so as much contrast as you can create between parts, it creates the illusion of 2 people playing. One person's holding out that D, and the other person's playing the line. Sorry. And that can create a really wonderful 3-dimensional effect. Moving on to the next section, we have a series of 3-note voicings. A lot of dissonance here. I'm looking down at measure 46. And we're using constant structure of fourths to create some nice dissonance. And for me, that's just another way of getting around a very simple turnaround, a common turnaround of 3-6-2-5-1. If you don't want to do that, there are a lot of different ways of addressing that turnaround harmonically. And a great ambiguous structure that you can use is these stacked fourths. And then, superimpose those over different roots. So in this case, I've used either the root or a chord tone in the bass. So we have this stacked fourth structure over A. I'm thinking it looks like a C minor 11 chord, but I'm just thinking of it as a structure over the flat 7th of D, moving into this chord over G, the root. Then another fourths down, whole step over an E, which is the 3rd of C7, which creates a nice half-step resolution into the F, and then we can use the stacked fourths here. And now it's like something coming into focus. We've got this. Now there's our tonality again. So that's just an example of another harmonic device that you can use to create something different over a very standard turnaround of 3-6-2-5-1. All right, moving on to the last page from that. There's some more triplet runs here that we have throughout the bridge section, and then a lot more dissonance. Let's take a look at the dissonance that's created in 58 and find out what's going on. At first listen, it sounds like it could be a mistake, but it actually is intentional. Again, I was just searching for another way to get through this familiar chord progression because, by the time we've made it this far into the song, you're familiar and the listener is familiar with the chord changes at this point. So why not do something different? And what I did was explore throughout some different polyrhythmic ideas and some bitonal ideas, which means creating two different tonality centers at the same time. So if we're going to take a look at measure 57, what we have is starting out with this voicing. And you could look at that and say that's an F altered voicing, but the way that I see it is kind of a combination between a B major triad and an F7 guide tone. So that's the bitonal part of it. It's simultaneously a B and an F, F7. And that's preceded up a half step by like a C over F sharp. And then it's just that B triad is outlined in a single note line. Now that's actually a voicing for the original change, E minor 7 flat 5. This has a 9 on it. But then we go into another bitonal chord, E flat over A, and then D flat over D, G altered, B over C, F altered. So if you play each of those parts by themselves, they don't sound very dissonant at all. I mean, we have this. That's your typical cycle in the bass. But what makes it sound so interesting is the structures. Now, even if you play the structures by themselves, they don't sound too bad. Check it out. Not too bad. But when you put them together using this bitonal effect, it sounds pretty out, I think, in a wonderful way. Now, you think it's going to resolve there to maybe something like a but we're not ready to resolve yet, at least not in my mind. In measure 61, we're going to continue this bitonal approach. And notice with the bitonality, what we've done to create dissonance is use two sounds or two tonal centers a tritone away, such as the B and the F, and then a half step away, such as the C sharp over D. Those are inherently dissonant figures, but they create a lot of nice motion. So instead of resolving to a straight B flat major 7 chord in 61, we're going to use an E major 7 on top of that, or in place of that. And then we're going to play a line that kind of simultaneously invokes E and B flat. It's like B flat major 7 sharp 11. And E minor 7 flat 5. So there is a connection, there is a relationship there to the original change. And then from there, we just use a very classic bebop turnaround with a single note line with a couple of thumb drops in there. So the single note line by itself is just classic bebop. We augment that by using the thumb drops to, again, give us a place of context with the bass notes. There's the D, C, and then bring it home with the low F and an F6-9 voicing. Have fun with this. I hope you enjoy this process.